Okay, Scott, welcome to episode 28. And this one takes me back to my journalism roots. So for me, I'm a bit of a fanboy for Brian Reid, and we're thrilled to have him here on the show and to learn more about what he's done with Cost Curve, which is our favorite newsletter.
Yeah, exactly. Good to see you again, Mark. And I'm excited for the episode as well. I think Brian's the addition of his voice to the conversation about drug pricing and access in the U.S. has been a very constructive one, and I'm looking forward to speaking with him.
Great. Well, Brian, welcome to the show.
Oh, I'm pumped to be here.
Well, we're thrilled for you to be here. And again, I love your newsletter. By the way, Scott's the one who introduced me to it.
So building your readership one by one, Brian.
I don't have a sales department. I'll take all the help I can get.
Well, for us and for our listeners as well, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you sort of your journey to develop and create the Cost Curve?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I started as a journalist. So I spent the first 10 years of my career writing about health science and health policy. Half of that was for Bloomberg, and then I freelanced for a while for everyone from Nature Biotechnology to Men's Health magazine, where I wrote stories about all kinds of goofy men's health related stuff. Not all of it which was family friendly, but it gave me a really interesting perspective on what media was. And then I spent 20 years at a PR firm, which again gave a different view of industry, working almost entirely with biopharma companies. And most of that time was spent in this kind of pivot from this idea that I wanted to talk a lot about innovation to this idea that maybe what industry needs to talk about more is its business model and how things work. And so I've really focused on that. I went to my CEO at the time in 2015, in the summer of 2015, and said, I really think that rather than treating drug pricing as this one-off where we're consistently starting from square one, why don't we build something a little bit more, foundational? And I said, I guess that's fine, go for it. And then 3 weeks later, Martin Shkreli crawls out of his hole, raises the price of Daraprim, and no one has ever asked me to justify this area of interest since then. About 2 years ago, I went out on my own, and the first thing I thought I needed to do from just a gathering my thoughts every day point of view, as well as kind of a marketing tool, was to put out a little newsletter that kind of curated what I saw first thing in the morning. And it's over time, Cost Curve has gone from that little newsletter that's kind of curated, the media stuff that hit my radar to something a little bit more substantial because there's just so much stuff.
Right. On that, let me just ask a follow-up. How do you navigate all the stuff that's coming in every day? Because this is you cite so many sources and so many studies. Like, help us understand sort of behind the scenes how you, as you said, curate the news for the day.
Well, it used to be a matter of curating the news. And so I would just, have a couple of Google searches, and the stuff that popped up, I'd be like, hey, this is what the Wall Street Journal is saying. Hey, this is what Biopharma Dive is saying. And then over time, I said, well, geez, you can't just do that. You had to look at what's going on in the medical literature. So now there's a couple of PubMed searches, set up. And then once people get your email address, it's like, hey, we're actually doing this thing, or just see this white paper or this other. And so now there's the point where it honestly looks more like journalism, where, I've got tipsters, I've got people who are emailing things. I got people, did you see this paper? And so it's gone from kind of curating what's out there to a little bit more of looking at that source material and just trying to get a sense of everything that's being created. Because, the reality is, like, if you're super into Nike sneakers, you've got like a choice of like 6 different newsletters, all of which have 500,000 subscribers. Like, if you're in that community, there's a place for you to go and learn about Nikes. Like, I feel like if you're really into the economics of the pharmaceutical industry, which is arguably more important than sneakers, there's nowhere else to go. And so the reason that Cost Curve exists is not so much that I have this great and burning passion to contribute to the dialogue, as much as the fact is that I'm worried that without it, there's just not a whole lot of dialogue. There's nowhere to go. So I kind of created the resource that I would like. And the fact that, the two of you read it is just a huge validation that maybe there's a demand out there for that sort of thing.
Yeah, for sure. So how about these days? How do you split your time between the PR advisory work and then the newsletter journalism stuff?
Yeah, so it's 100% of my time is spent thinking deeply for my clients, and then 100% of my time is spent on the newsletter and the journalism.
You
At
sound
least
like a lawyer in
that's
DC.
that's the
Uh,
way it feels. I mean, the
yeah.
reality is taking time, every morning to sift through this stuff, there's externalities. And so I feel like it makes me better at my job. So, you know, on a good day, it's gonna, there's gonna be 2 hours of sifting through and writing and uploading. Because it's happening kind of as fast as I can. And if you see errors, that is absolutely haste. That's
Right.
absolutely kind of haste and the lack of a support system. But
Sure.
I feel
Yeah.
like that's work that needs to get done by me, regardless of how much of it's for the newsletter and how much of it is just informing my take.
And I have one macro question that you've triggered for me even before we jump into some more detailed stuff, Brian. But you said, that this kind of started with your own curiosity about a broader thesis of how pricing fit into the business model and the sustainability of innovation, which is actually something that's near and dear to me. I wonder, before we start peeling back some of the elements here, what's your macro view about how the business model of the industry, how it's evolved over time, where we are at this point in time, what's happening, and where you think it may be headed?
So let me go even more macro. The reason I care about this at all is not, I was at an event a couple of weeks ago and someone said, well, economists like you and I really think, and I said, no,
Yeah.
no, I'm not an economist. This is like, I'm a flack. I'm a PR guy. But my thesis here is that industry, the biopharma industry, does a really good job of talking about innovation. If you get a phase 3 study, if you get a New England Journal piece, if
Yeah.
you've got a drug launch, we're fantastic about talking about that. And it shows up in polling data. If you ask the average American, has the pharmaceutical industry made
Yeah.
your life better? Like 70% say absolutely 100% yes. And if you turn them around and ask them the question, like, how do you feel about the business practices of the pharmaceutical industry? It's exactly upside down. So the
Yeah.
reputational issues of this industry are driven by a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding of the way the business practices operate. So from a macro view, my view is we need folks to understand this stuff better, because otherwise the industry's in a reputational hole. We're going to get bad policy. So, my shtick is always, we're not going to get a better system until we understand the system we have now. And if that understanding is screwed up, then we start putting into place policies that don't quite fix the problem and create these other unintended consequences. So from a macro view, like, we can talk about trends and things, but I think getting people more invested in talking about this and trying to push outside of the usual bubble is important, because I think that's where the industry runs into the kind of reputational risk that bleeds into policy risk, that bleeds into commercial risk.
Well, I think from our point of view, we sort of believe it as well, right? Like
Yeah.
the miracles of this industry come from the drug companies, right? Come from the research that's done, again, many cases backed by the government and then picked up by manufacturers. And so we know we're on the side of like these heroes that are creating these miracles, right?
Well, to be
So I,
clear, you guys are heroes in as well, because you want to talk about that externally. Like, we don't have this great
Yeah.
information ecosystem. So, like,
Yeah.
I'm happy about the newsletter, but I'm super happy to see podcasts like yours and just more people talking about this to the broadest possible audience. Because again, like, there's only so much forward progress we can make over cocktails at Assembia versus really trying to get these ideas out there.
right,
Yeah.
right. And so for you, to Scott's earlier point, like as you look at the drug, because we're going to dive into some of your other topics that you cover, right? But from a drug pricing perspective, we, again, as you said, we've covered it on different topics, and just did a series on value of drugs in the market. So where's your perspective on the drug pricing debate and some of the players? Is there hope here, or are we a little? Are you concerned?
I mean, I think there's good reason for concern. On the one hand, you can look at the way the system is set up, and it is not designed to kind of effectively drive low prices for consumers. People either love or hate the phrase middlemen, but there's a lot of money leaking out of the system in ways it's not entirely clear where that goes or who that benefits. And at the same time, there needs to be a recognition of trade-offs that, true innovation might be expensive, and we as a society need to figure out some ways of affording that and buying that. And if we think that, something is high value, but it's going to carry a high budget impact, what can we do to restructure society to put those miracle drugs at the top of the list? And that's really, really hard because, you talk about, geez, can we cover GLP-1s for everyone in Medicare? And, my view is absolutely. And that's worth, you can't say this out loud, but that's worth raising taxes. That's worth building 2 less battleships. These are societal goods and they need to be weighed against everything else society is doing. Yeah. And so, my view is that there's a lot of micro things that we can do to increase the efficiency and transparency of the system. But I would also love to have a macro, question of, is it necessarily a bad thing that a country of our size, of our wealth, is over-investing in breakthrough drugs? That's entirely possible. The answer there is yes. And we may need to make some trade-off questions to make that possible.
And okay, so what's your perspective on pricing trends these days? I know you track, both lists and as best as anyone can, kind of net pricing. Why don't we ground ourselves in that first before we dive into, some of the other topics?
Sure. I think we're living in a world in which once a medicine is on the market, its price is going to be pretty much set. We're not going to see, increases in list prices. Net prices is going to continue to be, a little bit, opaque. It's going to continue to come down to negotiation. But, we have this 10-year pattern of essentially year-over-year net price declines. And I don't see that changing. IQVIA doesn't see that changing. That seems to be the world we live in. I think the flip of that is to say, well, then when drugs come on the market, that price has got to be really important, right? And I think this is where a lot of my time and attention has gone into, how do we think about launch prices? How do we value launch prices? How do we talk about launch prices? How are they disclosed? And what are some of the distinctions we need to make there? Because that's really where, the drive and budget impact comes from. It's not necessarily from the existing armamentarium getting more expensive. It's from the fact that every year we get 50 awesome new drugs and we got to figure out, where those fit into the system.
It's confounded too, as because the industry has, we've migrated from the days of the primary care markets with, lots of patients and low per patient prices to now the opposite of that, really. Those are all genericized, and it's very hard for the innovative industry to make money in those markets now. And so the focus is on all the small population, specialty oncology, rare diseases, and so on. And so then you wind up with, very small populations and very high prices. And so then this comparison of what's happening to list prices over time. And it gets very caught up in what's the technology mix as well.
Yeah, I think the idea of mix is probably underappreciated in the broader dialogue.
Okay. You had a story last month that was one of my favorites because I hadn't thought about it in the way you presented it, which was the highest importance to attention ratio. So topics that are very important that are maybe not getting the attention that they deserve, right? Where'd you come up with that? Help us understand your process for that.
Well, I think there's a lot of things, and you all know this, and a lot of folks inside the industry knows there are topics that come up a lot that we talk a lot about internally that just don't seem to have resonance in the population at large. And those are the stories that are interesting to me because, again, this is often where we trip up from a policy standpoint because there are things that we all recognize, but if Joe Sixpack doesn't get it, chances are the policymakers are not going to be properly engaged in that kind of stuff. So there's always this sense of, what are the big deal things that we're just not talking about enough? And then kind of what's my obligation to kind of raise those and say, hey, what can we do to talk more about these things that are probably really important, but either because they're complicated or they're dull or they're happening at the fringes tend to get ignored. It drives me nuts to see, you've got 6,000 journalists chasing the same 3 stories every day, and yet there's some really big deal things happening that I would love to see more attention on.
Great. Can we maybe dive into sort of the 5 topics you identified.
Let's do it. Yeah.
Okay, let's start with the first one, the death of the retail pharmacy.
So I grew up in a small town, and my pharmacist was a guy named Billy Rakevitz, and he was basically the mayor of the town. Everyone knew Billy. If you wanted to know anything, you'd go into Billy's, where there's a luncheonette at the front and Billy in the back. And for me, it was this foundational idea that Billy was absolutely as much of this community as John the electrician and Mel the plumber and Jim the dentist. Like that was, and the idea is that whole ecosystem is under great threat. Not just the idea of an independent pharmacist like Billy, but all retail pharmacy. So you've got about 60,000 retail pharmacies in the United States. And their economics are under incredible pressure. It is not really a viable business right now. And maybe there's some front of the store stuff, and maybe there's vaccine administration. There's other ways to keep afloat. But on the basic principle of providing drugs to people, that's an industry that is not sustainable. And again, there's 60,000 retail pharmacies in the United States. There are 14,000 McDonald's. So if you think about it, like, if you just wiped all the McDonald's off the face of the earth, or out of the United States anyway, like that would be 1/4 of the impact of the idea that retail pharmacy might die. And so, if you were going to tell me that we're going to shutter all the McDonald's, over the next 18 months, you get headlines in every newspaper in the country. And the idea that we're going to lose the equivalent of all of the McDonald's in the next 18 months, and that's a conservative, estimate. That feels like there's not quite enough attention on that.
Yeah. And what's triggered this, Brian? Why are they under such duress?
I mean, essentially, they are at the bottom of the food chain, and their contracts with the PBMs are at this point. I don't want to be pejorative, but I'm going to call them predatory. That's pretty pejorative. But the pharmacy model has changed in such a way that it used to be that, yes, we'll lose a little money on brand, or we'll basically break even on brand, but there are certain generics or specialty generics where we can make that back. And I think what we're seeing is the shift is away from that, and there are efforts underway by the PBMs to maybe even that out, but not in a way that's going to return pharmacy to the point where it is a viable business model on the selling drugs to retail patients, basis. And so again, that's one where it's very difficult to talk to people and not come away with the idea that there's not a huge glorious solution in the offing here. This is one where there's going to be some pain before we get to stasis.
Yeah. And how much do you think the centralized, mail order pharmacies, Mark Cuban as an example or whatever, can fill in for some of this?
I mean, I think if you're a consumer and you're taking generic drugs, fantastic, great option, wonderful. And there's a lot of other ways to kind of tap into those low prices. I don't think any of that, again, solves that, retail pharmacy. And look, I like having the equivalent of Billy around because, I can go get it immediately. If my kid's got an ear infection, I have to wait for it to come by mail. Like there's a lot of reasons why that's a community service. And again, you would love some way of preserving that. The economics are just not in the favor.
Yeah. What about the second topic, the rise of pseudo pharma companies? Tell us about that.
So this is the idea that PBMs are getting into the biosimilar game by essentially partnering with biosimilar manufacturers, white labeling these products according to these new companies. CVS has Cordavis, and there's Qualant and Nuvalia out there. And the idea is, the PBMs kind of make this Faustian bargain with the biosimilars manufacturers that we will provide you value. Or not value, volume, and then we're going to kind of take a cut, and we're going to then put that on formulary. We're not necessarily going to go to the lowest net price. We're going to favor our own product, and it's fascinating because I think it showcases a couple of things. One, it showcases the power of PBMs to come up with new business models, and it really shows the way that if you can find some ways to skim money out of the middle, it's incredibly attractive. At the same time, to give PBMs credit, it's also a great way of driving some degree of sales, like, and some degree of price decrease. The reality is we've had low cost, basically pharmacy benefit biosimio. Humira came on the market at low prices and no one used it. And PBMs finally figured out this way to drive some volume to lower price products, which is great. But we're still not at this world in which the cheapest medicine is going to win. So it's just kind of been fascinating to see that as a piece of system engineering that, again, it's going to drive some benefit to patients and employers, but there's always going to be that piece of some of that money is going to now flow not to the biosimilar manufacturer, not to the employer or the patient, but it's going to get stuck in the middle again. And the PBM industry's creativity in finding those places is for better or for worse, it's noteworthy. And I think this is just a really illustrative example of what that creativity looks like.
Yeah. I think in some respects, if you go back over 20, 30 years, that has been like the cornerstone of their business model. It's been migrating from profit pool to profit pool along the way, while trying to serve their customers and patients and everyone as well. And then it creates the kind of the conflicts of interest and execution problems that you described. All right, let's go to the farm to table, farm, PHARM to table movement. I know you're enamored with that. Tell us about it.
Well, mostly enamored with the name because up until I heard that from ldquo about 2 weeks ago, people were calling kind of the DTC model, which is both not entirely accurate and not nearly as satisfying as calling it farm to table. But I think that what's fascinating there is this idea that, originally I thought, well, this is the kind of Lilly Direct phenomenon. Novo plays in this area a little bit. Pfizer plays in this area a little bit. There are a couple of other companies that have like telehealth company partnerships. And at first I thought, especially with Lilly Direct, that this was just beginning to lay down some plumbing for an alternative financial system. The money was not necessarily flowing directly through insurers and PBMs, but it kind of built the system in which you could begin shuffling the pieces in such a way that you didn't necessarily need to use the traditional system. And I thought that was the great innovation, and it wasn't necessarily being fully optimized right now, but all of that piping was in place. But I think the other part of this that is probably more immediate and more noteworthy is, I've heard some folks talk about it, and they talk about the importance of the patient experience with healthcare from end to end, from the moment you decide that you think you need to get this thing checked out and want to go through the diagnostic process, all the way to when the pills or the pens arrive at your door. What can we do to own that, to maximize that experience for you as a patient, in the same way that, quite frankly, Nike, from the moment they want you to put a sneaker on your foot, like they can manage that to make it a surprise and delight kind of thing. And this is what Costco does, and this is what Apple does, and any other consumer-focused industry talks about we're hyper-focused on the consumer from end to end. In healthcare, when you talk about customer, this is the fun thing about healthcare. If you go to almost anyone in the healthcare system and say, who's your customer? Almost no one, maybe some clinicians, but almost no one else says the patient is our customer. And what farm to table starts doing is it puts this idea that, a pharmaceutical company views this person as a customer, and they should get that same white glove treatment throughout the whole process, and not just kind of at the end where the medicine actually appears. And that's just a revolution in how we think about things. And like, how easy is this to pull off from a legal and a regulatory and a management standpoint? And is it really going to catch on? And is it good for all medicines at all times? Like, that's still TBD. But there's a little bit of a revolution in just saying, we think that this person is our customer and we're going to treat them with just as much care as Nordstrom treats their customer. Like, we've not had that ever in this system.
Well, I would say, Mark, your career we've had a version of it, a different version of it, Brian. We've had very extensive manufacturer-sponsored patient support services.
Yes.
But but not the kind of end-to-end experience, that you're describing, obviously, with something like Lilly Direct or whatever. And it is a very interesting evolution of the model. I wonder, and it's easier for me to imagine it for medicines like the weight loss drugs that have a more modest price, where some patients are motivated and able to pay out of pocket. But much more difficult when you think of, multiple sclerosis medicines or anti-inflammatories or whatever with a much higher. What's your sense about that? Can the farm to table model, without where you started, which is like, maybe this is new piping for a new finance approach, can it make that transition, or does it have to create the new finance approach to do that?
I mean, I get the feeling that this is going to be a model that's going to be really flexible, and certain parts of this are going to be really useful in certain ways. So again, with obesity, maybe you don't even need the kind of front end telehealth. Someone else can do that. If you go to Lilly Direct, Row, the telehealth provider isn't on there, but if you go directly to Row, then you can plug into Lilly's back end and get the cash price. Like, there's a lot of different ways to structure it. So Lilly's even said, look, we've put our Alzheimer's medicine on Lilly Direct, and they're not doing fulfillment. There's some telehealth, but it's just a way of saying, look, from the moment you decide, does my dad maybe have a memory problem? We want to start holding your hand then, not at the end of the process where you've got the diagnosis, and companies have always done disease education, and to your point, patient service hub. But can we really package this so that maybe we're going to put our emphasis at different places along that continuum, but we're going to think about every disease state and figure out what does the patient need from us at each individual point, and can we somehow program that? Yeah. And again, I think we're going to see a lot of experiments. We're going to see some of them fail, because I think to your point, the answer is we're not going to need everything for everything, but thinking in this way is going to get us different solutions than we might have had 20 years ago.
Let's turn to another topic that was covered in your newsletter was 340B. That's a big one, and I know you've covered it a lot even this week. Tell us.
You're on a roll. You're doing a daily mention. Right?
340B abuse was the topic.
I've got a reader who emails me every time I mention 340B and just says, "What is this all you're going to talk about?" And so now I've kind of taken it as a personal challenge. Because honestly, you talk about people in the industry, that's all they want to talk about, which is a radical change from 3 years ago, where they're like, oh God, we have to talk about 340B. And there's so many different ways to talk about 340B. And the abuse piece, I think, is interesting because, like, you can talk a lot about the way the system is set up and this and that and the patient definition, and you can really get into the policy weeds. But what's fascinating to me now is there was a point at which everyone agreed, or at least everyone could make the case, that the things they were doing, the expansion of contract pharmacy, the expansion of covered entities, all of this stuff was in service of the patient at the end of the day. We're using it to expand charity care. We need the contract pharmacies because we have to meet the patient needs. And I talk about 340B abuse because we're seeing this rise of these small for-profit middlemen sitting in the middle of things, trying to divert 340B in a way that is kind of explicitly not interested in, the vulnerable patient, low-income American bit. Like, they're explicit. We want to take this revenue stream and aim it at employers who don't get the benefit of 340B. And, honestly, if I was an employer, I would certainly be like, hey, why is this geyser of money flowing in the other direction? But everyone is relatively shameless now about saying, oh yeah, we understand how this system works. We're going to aim that geyser of money at employers. We're going to grab a few fistfuls for ourselves, and that's okay. That's good. That's allowable. And I think we're at a different point now where you can talk about all of the kind of philosophical issues with 340B, but now we've got these folks in the middle who are just, again, without apology, moving the system in a way that I don't think anyone, intended when it was designed. And there's not even a fig leaf there anymore.
No, not at all. There wasn't. And it's to the point where, you have these 340B hospitals that are buying, suburban oncology practices and sending all the commercial business through 340B. And so, in the meantime, They're, as you've just put in your newsletter, the charity care is just it's non-existent.
Yeah. It's flat at 2% everywhere, or declining. And so in a world in which 340B revenues are up at 20% every year, we're not seeing that reflected anywhere else in the system. That money is going straight. Actually, I say it's going straight. Like, we know where it's going. No one knows where it's going, but it's not going to charity care. So, according to the stats.
As I reflect on this from my own experience working in some companies and including on pricing, I mean, the reality is today, the manufacturers all know this is out there and it's coming, and it just gets priced back to the launch price thing again. It gets, and the whole burgeoning middle piece, the support services and the copay assistance and all of those things, all of the Band-Aids to help manage, the complexity of the system that we have, they all just get priced in to the beginning, which then, again, it obscures the value question and the business model, and it alienates people because they don't understand it and all those kinds of things. We seem to be caught in kind of a vicious loop. It's like I've written some academic papers with some collaborators, and one of my collaborators calls it the war of all against all.
Absolutely. And there's so much blame to go around that it's very easy to wrap yourself in a sense of moral superiority. But the reality is no one would build the system. No one would build 340B the way we have it now. I mean, my sense is that industry doesn't like spending $60 billion to prop up this thing. But if we were going to spend $60 billion, we'd love for that money to go to the right place. And boy, that is not happening now, or there's no evidence that it's happening now.
The final topic in the highest importance to attention stories was employers and benefit design.
Yeah.
Speaking of a key component in the war of all against all.
Yeah.
Help us understand your thoughts on that one.
I mean, I think one of the most fascinating trends of the last 18 months is this idea that if you work for a company and they massively overpay for their abiraterone or their imatinib, and that drives up your premiums, you have a cause of action as a fiduciary to take against your company. And I know the first couple lawsuits have not necessarily gone the way that the advocates would have wanted here, but it's begun to seed this idea. And the fact that Mark Cuban goes around banging his drum every day, telling employers to be less dumb, in much more colorful language, I think adds to this. But the reality is there's a lot of shenanigans that are buried in these relationships between the health plans and employers that no one's really looked at. I don't know. What's abiraterone? Is that a kind of fish? Like, do I care if that's priced at $11,000 or $150? Like, I'm not going to go line through this. My benefit consultant's not going to help me. And I think in the last 2 years, you've got a sense of, and again, no one has been a better advocate for this than Mark, of going like, yeah, you damn well better know what you're paying for abiraterone, because your premiums are going up and up and up. Employers are realizing that they have to subsidize a bigger and bigger percentage of that premium increase. They can't pass it down to their employees. And if you want to be taken seriously, not only do is it a matter of fiduciary duty, but is it a matter of just kind of like good management on your part? It's become, I think, increasingly in vogue to ask those questions now. What do we need to do to get employers to be able to, thoughtfully analyze those contracts? Like that. It's a lot easier to point fingers than it is to educate. But I think that trend, that idea that employers really are the backstop, and everyone in the industry has been saying this for 10 or 20 years, like, hey, employers are really the end user here. We're beginning to see employers recognize that. And I think that's a very good trend, because there is a war of all against all, and it was often seen as manufacturers, payers, and providers. And employers were kind of like grouped in there with payers. But the reality is they're their own thing, and they need to think more thoughtfully about where they sit in the ecosystem and what they can do.
Yeah. It reminds me, Mark, of our earlier guest, Matt Orr, and the work he's trying to do to help employers thinking about this. And Brian, it's not just the premiums, especially, these days we've got so many more covered lies people exposed to the high deductible plans and the co-insurance as well. And so it's even at like an individual patient level, it can really be, a big burden.
Oh yeah, no, and the last time you do not want to be surprised by your copay on a drug that should be $150, that's 11 grand.
Yeah.
Or your co-insurance, quite frankly.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, that's the run of the list of the topics that ought to be getting more coverage in the mainstream, but aren't. Thanks for that. We were also interested. You had called out that you thought this year the most important story would be the potential threat of the Trump administration policies on the innovation ecosystem. So we'd like to turn to that a little bit and tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that and how you're thinking about it now.
I mean, so to the extent to which we have had, a golden age in U.S. biomedicine over the past 3 decades, what are the root causes of that? You could say, one, we've got an incredibly well-funded public research foundation, through the NIH and our university system. Number two, we've had a really good, capital has been available. We've had people willing to take the risk. We've had the kind of innovation, ecosystem that's allowed for these ideas to get turned into drugs. That could then be priced competitively and that money recycled back into the ecosystem. And the third thing is we've had a relatively predictable regulatory state, right? Like we know what the FDA standards are going to be. If that's the model, right now, all 3 of those pieces, are under threat. Obviously in the last, 6 weeks, we've seen that foundational research, really gummed up. We're seeing huge threats to the FDA. And you can make the argument that, the threats to the broader commercial, availability of capital and the ability to get a return on your investment, that's been under threat for some time, going back to the IRA and even before that. So all of these key pillars that we had in place 15, 20 years ago are now seriously eroding. And I think the question is, how much worse is it going to get? And is there anything that can be done to kind of stop that bleeding? And I think I don't have great answers for that, but I think we need to recognize that, we've had a real good run of it. And if you look at the rest of the world, the trajectories are all different, and kind of examining that should give a hint as to where we want to go. And I'm not sure we're picking the right path.
Yeah. I would add, I agree with all your drivers. I would add declining global willingness to pay as another one as well.
But I mean, if you look at that, when you say declining global willingness to pay, you're really talking about Europe, right? And
now in the U.S. too.
Right. But if you look, Europe has had a declining willingness to pay for a long time. And if you look at their R&D investment over the last 20 years, it's a line that used to be above the United States, and now it's, and they are just in a year-over-year death spiral.
Yeah.
And who's, jumping in to take their place? It's the country that is throwing money at basic research faster than anyone else in the history of the world, and that's China. So you see these two crossing lines, and you go, what policy decisions have they made to just destroy their ecosystem in Europe? And I worry that we're starting to make some of those same mistakes here.
Yeah, there's clear industrial policy, I think, in China these days to try to support their own biotech industry. I would actually, thinking about the categories we just covered, things that aren't being discussed enough, how about adding this one to that? I mean, even like company CEOs, and I get why they don't. It's not like in any individual CEO's company to talk about how tough the world has gotten or whatever, and that we don't have good answers for it. But it feels to me like there ought to be a broader understanding of this dynamic as well, and more people talking about it.
Oh, I agree completely. I think the tough thing is that the solutions here are not simple or elegant. That we, you can wave your hands and say maybe there's some sort of magic trade policy, but at the end of the day, unless companies are willing to say no to citizens of fill in the blank high income country, which no one wants to get up there and say, look, we could sell this drug at a slight increase of our marginal cost. Like it would still technically be profitable, but that's a ridiculous business decision. You can't make that decision. You
Well,
can't do that to
there was the
patients.
time. There was the time when they did, and we, Scott and I both
They
started
they
our
they actually
careers.
still do, and it's there's more companies walking away from European markets, let's say, as an example now than say 10 years ago, but still a minority.
And you can see that, and you can just see the time to entry, eroding.
Yeah,
So
that's
I
right.
think
The time
in
to
the last
entry is a
5 years,
part of it.
there's 140 drugs that have been approved in the past 5 years that are available here in the United States that aren't in Europe, and they
Yeah.
will probably eventually. But which system do you want to be in if you're staring down a cancer diagnosis?
Yeah, and I just want to turn to the topic of patience, right? Because that's
Yeah.
where, even from my career, I've seen the key thing for why manufacturers stepped into these countries was because they wanted to cure these diseases, right, and make a difference. In this country, patients are dealing with the problems with access and affordability, and I think I would put that into the same bucket as
Right.
not talked about enough,
Not understood
undercovered,
well enough,
not
right.
understood and not covered, related to its importance. So tell us a little bit more about access and affordability and what you're seeing around that topic.
Well, I mean, this is something that you all are way closer than I am. I would say as a communicator, we're dealing with a couple of different things. One is that patients don't understand. There's too much complexity in the system. Patients don't understand what's happening to them, and so if you look and that complexity comes at a cost, and that cost is borne by patients. And it's not always a financial cost, although sometimes it is. And if you look at accumulators, maximizers, alternative funding programs, like accumulators take money from patients, but you could say that maximizers and AFPs are designed in such a way that we're just shifting the money around. But patients are harmed because it's complex, and they're accepting some risk that something is going to go wrong. And if and you all are closer to this than I am, you've heard the horror stories of these programs that are supposed to be patient friendly, they're supposed to be cost controlling, but again, we're putting on patients these additional costs. Even if they're not financial costs, they're nonetheless this cost of additional risk, this cost of additional complexity, and we're not explaining it at all. And so, I'm on an exchange plan, and someone said, "Well, geez, do you guys have an accumulator?" And I was like, I consider myself pretty educated. And I'm like, I actually have no idea. I got to go back and look at my state law and what my document said. Like, if you want to try to answer that question, even if you're knowledgeable, boy, they make it as hard as possible. And so I think that's the reality on patient access is we've got all these systemic things we can, that we still need to solve. But the reality is we can't talk about this in a way that people understand in the least.
Well, the complexity is a recurring theme on the podcast as well, as you guys know. So, all right. Well, listen, this has been wonderful to get to dive into some of this with you, Brian. And I know we could keep going, but we've got to wrap it up. And we always, at the end of our discussions with our guests, we give you the chance to hold the magic wand for a day and make your own prescription for better access. If there were one thing that you could do, what would that be?
Well, I think I'm trying to do it in my little way, and you're trying to do it in your little way, and it gets back to that communications idea. We're not going to get a better system until we understand the system we have now. But the challenge is, and this goes especially out to your listeners, if you are in the system, if you are an employer or a provider or a payer or a manufacturer, you have an obligation to spend a certain amount of your time trying to describe what the heck is going on to your customers. And I use customers in the sense of patients. And that's the real challenge is I think everyone sees this, it's a war of all against all. But what that also, though, the war against all also allows us to think that the obligation to educate is someone else's problem. And you can think of 1,000 different places where, and in fact, one of the interesting ones is the smoothing program under the IRA in which, Medicare beneficiaries can spread their drug costs out. The pharmacies say, that's the PBM's responsibility. And the PBM say, no, we're kicking that down to the pharmacy. And the manufacturers say, it's not really our issue. And all of a sudden you've got all these studies coming out saying, well, why isn't anyone using the MPPP? And the reality is it's because everyone thinks that that's someone else's obligation. And I would love to change the way the system works as a whole to say everyone is responsible for this level of education. And if that means consumers are bombarded, I'm more than happy to live in that world.
Well, that's great, Brian. Couldn't agree more, right? I think we're all trying to get there. And I think in our own way, we're, at least when Scott and I with this podcast is like in what you're doing, start the dialogue, start the conversation, start talking about it. And hopefully we're helping to move this towards some sort of a truce in the war of all against all, and some way that, patients could get easier access and not be burdened by the high costs. So totally agree with what your prescription for better access is.
Baby steps.
All right, Mark, shall we wrap things up?
Let's do it.
It has been wonderful having Brian here. Thank you, Brian, for joining us. I really just really enjoyed hearing the perspective of somebody, kind of fresh eyes, if you will, he spent his career obviously in the domain, but not like as an operator,
Right.
more as a observer,
Right.
and communicator. And so that brings, in my mind, it creates a kind of a fresh point of view about this stuff, which I really was energized by. It's obviously a well-informed outsider, not quite an outsider, but anyway, I really enjoyed that, and all of the individual topics I thought were wonderful. And I know we could do an episode on each one.
Right.
And then I like also the call to action to say, listen, we've got to start with more discussion, better understanding, more simplification, and rationalization of the existing, system. And that feels right to me, and feels powerful to me. Feels like, too much of this stuff, frankly, isn't getting discussed enough. I think he's right.
Right. No, I agree. For me, let's start with the cost curve, right? And Brian, by the way, thank you again for joining us. Brian, I think he's like our own AI for drug pricing, our own large language model, our LLM. He's got this knowledge that you put in these complex questions, and out comes like this very clear, like these are the issues. This is the things we should be talking about. And I think that's just fantastic. And I'm a big fan of what he's doing. And he's also, as you said, like he's got this sort of outsider perspective that's now diving in. But what he's seeing are these trends where you look at where the system is being exploited. This complex system, we're all tied up in this Gordian knot, right? Like we've been in it, we've been a part of it. And then you get somebody from the outside who comes in and says, well, look who's exploiting that, and look who's exploiting that, And I think that this drug system, drug pricing, drug reimbursement system that we have, there's just continue to be too many people exploiting these sort of crevices of whether it's 340B or other things of the industry. And then finally, I guess for me, again, I feel hopeful. Like I know that there's a lot of negative. We're in a really tough time with the Trump administration policy. But, I truly am hopeful that this is going to help. Like, I feel like we got somebody else on our team, that's now helping us like move the ball or move the rock up the hill, right? Like the, Sisyphus, right?
Yeah.
Move the rock up the hill. And so I feel like we've got some others that are joining us. And so for that, I feel really hopeful.
Yeah. And grateful.
Grateful. So welcome, Brian, to the fight, and thank you for what you're doing.
No club I'd rather be a part of.
There we go. Well, except for the ice hockey world national championship, that'd be a good one too, right?
We got my daughter's got 3 more shots at it. So
there we go. Well, we're gonna be. I will say that for the first time I followed college hockey, women's hockey this year. So. Thank you for giving us somebody to root for.
One convert at a time.
There we go. All right. Well, with that, Brian, again, thank you for joining us. Scott, thank you for being my co-host. And thank you all to the listeners for, once again, your support. And if you have any questions or comments or ideas for new episodes, let us know at comments@prescription for better access. That's all spelled out, prescriptionforbеттeraccess.com. And with that, we wrap up episode 28. Thank you.